Everyone. So, today we're going to have a ducking interview. Now, it is on a subject which can be rather upsetting. I know I tend to keep the channel relatively light, but, sometimes the less positive aspects of humanity need a bit of discussion too. And while this is going to be about ancient antiquity, just to warn you, the subject matter is still within an area that has still got effects lasting into the modern day. So, viewer discretion is advised, and so, on to the interview. Thank you. So, for the viewers at home, would you please introduce yourself and the area of your expertise you will be discussing with us today?
I will be discussing Roman slavery, which I have a master's degree, or at least a master's degree in representations of Roman slavery.
And you are?
And my name is Thomas Peaple.
Thank you. So, how did the ancient Romans define slavery?
Yes, slavery can have many meanings. That's why it's a very important question, because there are terms like slave labour, wage slaves and so on. Now, for the purposes of this discussion, I think we are talking, to me, of Roman slavery as in slavery where one person is property of another and, crucially, can be bought and sold as a commodity, distinguishing it from, for example, the Spartan helots, who in many respects were just like slaves, but could not be bought and sold. That's not to say their lives were any better for it. It's just factually there is a difference because they could not be bought and sold as a commodity, even though they were essentially property in other respects.
Okay. So, given more recent slave societies, there has been developed an image of enslaved people as being black, sometimes leading to enslaved people in ancient Rome being depicted as black. How far would you say the Romans enslaved people based on race, and on what basis would the ancient Romans have seen race?
Race as in no Roman could be a slave is probably the only way it was racial. Regarding skin colour, the way we would understand race to mean today, no, there were plenty of white slaves. That's not to say there weren't slaves from Africa, so to depict some Roman slaves as black is not inaccurate, but to suggest all of them were would also be inaccurate.
From what I understand, ancient Rome was, for the time, a heavily urbanised society with a large population of landless poor having to sell their labour for subsistence, which makes me wonder why Rome maintained slavery when the wage slavery of labour force would have led to fewer revolts, for example.
Yes, this is a very interesting question. As I understand it, from what I've read on the scholarship, this is a matter of debate and something of a mystery. For context, Finlay argued there are only 5 slave societies in history. By that he meant, or to use his definition, 20% or more people in them are slaves. There may be many other societies that had some slaves, but the 20% mark was his rule. Now, of those 5, 3 of them, the Caribbean in the late 19th century, the American South prior to the Civil War, and Brazil until I believe the late 19th century, all were areas where basically some people were inhabiting an area that didn't have a lot of people, it didn't have a poor people to use. And that's not to defend slavery, I'm just saying, if you'd ask why those people in the Caribbean, Brazil or the American South chose slavery, the answer is they didn't have a landless poor to use. Now, slavery in Athens is sometimes explained by saying, well, they didn't have many landless poor. They had plenty of poor people, but they weren't landless. So they weren't desperate enough for money to do things like go down the silver mines. So they used slavery for that, because basically other city-states in Greece like Corinth would have done it by using the power that the oligarchy had over the ordinary people to make them by force, or at least, by passing some kind of declaration. They would have ordered the poor people down the mines. this wasn't an option for Athens because in democracy everyone has a vote, so they use slavery. So that leaves the Roman Empire, where we have a lot of slaves, even though, as you say, we have a landless poor. They're certainly there. Yes, for part of Rome's history it was a democracy, but that wouldn't have stopped them using money as an incentive, particularly as more and more people ended up landless and therefore in need of wages. So slavery in the Roman Empire is an ongoing mystery.
Given the reformer faction within Roman politics, the urban poor for whom slave labour was a direct competitor for work, and the fact that there were contemporaries of ancient Rome such as China and India where slavery was abolished, was there a debate on slavery in the Roman Empire as happened in later slave societies?
Not as far as we can tell. It's very difficult because most people were illiterate, so the voice of the landless poor, who indeed would have been most concerned about slavery, you would think, has been lost forever because most of them were illiterate. Even among those who could write, most documents have been destroyed or lost over time because, with no printing press, fewer copies to start with, making them more vulnerable to destruction. So, as far as we can tell, there was no abolitionist movement. We even have an account of a Roman traveller who talks about a group of people without slaves very much as someone who lived in Britain today or America today would probably talk about people who'd never heard of television. So that would indicate that the Romans couldn't imagine a world without slavery, but due to the limited records that survive, it would not be fair to say more than, as far as we can tell, there was no abolitionist movement.
While not exactly seen in a good light, it seems fair to say that Roman slavery is often depicted as less brutal than slavery in later eras. Is there anything about Roman slavery to cause that, or is it more of a sort of longer time gap between ancient Rome and now?
One cannot ignore the political aspects of suggesting a positive image of slaves in the American South. After all, slavery was part of America, who were making the films, or a lot of the films. So basically for them there's a direct link to their ancestors, and because of the racial element we discussed earlier, many would feel the problems of slavery are even now still with us. After all, slavery ended in 1865, but that was followed by a century roughly of segregation, and even when segregation ended, many would argue black people whose ancestors were mostly slaves remain treated as second-class citizens, or at the very least did until very, very recently. So there is perhaps more of a concern about appearing to portray slaves in the American South in a positive light. Anyone who's seen the film 12 Years a Slave may notice that in the book Solomon Northup wrote, he refers to his first master as a good man who had been blinded to the evils of slavery by the world he lived in, but was still someone who treated slaves well and was good in many respects. In the film this is very much toned down, with aspects inserted such as him knowing that Northup was born free and doing nothing about it, possibly because to portray a nice slave owner is so politically dangerous in America. Whereas the Romans, I admit I haven't watched many Italian films on the issue, but certainly to the American and British filmmakers there's not the same direct heritage. It is longer ago, and I would say even in aspects they may have tried to emulate Rome, it's still a somewhat different issue than thinking about your direct ancestors. Plus, you may feel that it hasn't had the same lingering effects as the American South did, because there aren't a load of people today who are Romans getting to treat everyone else as inferior because they used to be slaves. Now, regarding whether Roman slavery itself was better, this is a very long debate that you can throw in many different directions, because we don't have detailed reports or statistics, so we have to rely on anecdotal evidence. We have evidence of cruel treatment of slaves, we have evidence of good treatment of slaves, but which was common, what was the norm it's very hard to tell. Partly because every piece of evidence is anecdotal and can go in quite a few directions. We could be here all day, but I'm just going to give you two examples, one both ways. Let's start with the account in Seneca of a slave master who fed his slaves to the fish. So we have a man who thought throwing a slave and having them eaten by animals basically for fun was acceptable. So Romans treated slaves badly. Ah, say the other side. But look, Seneca's condemning it. Surely that means Romans like him didn't like it either. So we may have one person being brutal to slaves, we have other people who clearly have a problem with that. Ah, say the other side again. But Seneca was writing about anger. That's where he records it, his work on anger. So is his issue with the fact that the man killed his slave by feeding them to the fishes, or is his real issue with the fact that he had a problem with doing it in passion? Is he so arguably he's not saying harming slaves is wrong, he's saying doing anything because you're letting your emotions rule you is wrong. Therefore, would he have considered the slave master who calmly considered the facts and decided to kill his slave to be fine? We don't know. To use an example the other way, we have a document where Pliny, I believe it's the Younger, records buying a house for his nanny, who we're pretty sure was a slave at the time, even if she may have been freed in between. So, this is compassion, right? This is a man looking after his former nanny by giving her a house even though she was a slave. That's good, right? Ah, but the other side say, throughout the document he says very little about the nanny's virtues or her merits. All he ever talks about is the house he's giving her. Doesn't this show it's just him showing off? It's not concern for the slave, he just likes to be able to show people that he's so rich he can just give a house away like that. Yes, say the other side, but this is a legal document. It's the equivalent of deeds in landowning today. So of course he's not going to talk about the nanny, it's not relevant. What's relevant is that the document makes it clear what properties he's giving her so there can be no doubt. You could give someone else a day without saying how nice they are. It doesn't mean you don't think it. It's just not relevant to the legal document. So as you can see, we have various pieces of evidence that may show good or bad treatment of slaves, but they can actually go in a number of ways. So, to summarise, we cannot ignore the possibility that due to the racial dimensions being different and there being a longer time gap, it is easier to portray nice slave owners in Rome than it would be in the American South. But it is also possible, though by no means clear, that Romans did treat their slaves better. But I'm just going to quickly caveat this before I move on. None of what I've just said should be seen as condoning or defending the concept of slavery. Even well-treated slaves are still a grotesque idea, because it still assumes that one person is superior to another to the point of being able to treat them as property. You can treat a Mercedes very well, it doesn't mean you consider it a person. So however much some people may have looked after their slaves better than others, I'm not in any way trying to suggest that makes slavery itself all right. It isn't.
It is fair to say, since the, to lack of a better word, fall of Rome, the Roman system has often been desired to be emulated. The Holy Roman Empire, the Pax Britannica, the civil law system in Europe today. But despite this, Roman slavery allows them to be used as the vile oppressor, be it in Spartacus, Asterix the Gaul, Caesar's Legion in Fallout New Vegas being a deliberate emulation of Rome and being an empire of slavery and of oppression and slavery. How does one reconcile an admiration for ancient Rome with the way Rome enslaved people?
Basically, if you want to have an admiration for Rome, you have two choices, because obviously one option is to not have an admiration for Rome, but if you do, there's two choices. You would have to condone slavery, or you have to accept that there are some aspects of Rome that may have been good, but there are other things that weren't. It's an ongoing debate you can have in a number of aspects of life. I mean, do you love Caravaggio's paintings while still accepting that he killed someone? Or do you say that because he killed someone we shouldn't like Caravaggio? should Michael Vick be in the NFL Hall of Fame after what he did to those dogs? You know, can you separate his achievements as a quarterback from the animal cruelty he did? And I think it's the same here. Can you, and this is for every individual to decide, can you accept that the Romans may have done a lot of things that were good or at least praiseworthy, but still have done something as awful as had slaves?
Now, what advice would you give to someone creating a historical depiction of ancient Rome when broaching the subject of Roman slavery?
I think if you want to show Romans as cruel oppressors, you'll find it very easy. There were certainly some slaves who were treated badly, and you can show Roman baddies treating them horribly. If you want to portray Romans in a positive light, then you probably do have a trickier aspect. I mean, Caroline Lawrence very sensibly shows various depictions of slave cruelty. We have the slave who was falsely accused and then sold to the bathhouses who beat him for fun. The slave who was abused by her master and got pregnant twice as a result. The children who were being used as forced labour and even going blind due to complete lack of care. But, despite all these brutal depictions of slavery, she still has her main character completely be okay with having slaves, because she's just being honest. The main character treats her slaves well. Two of them actually are probably almost family. I say two or one because one of them is freed relatively early in the books. But there's another who's always a slave, and she's still practically family. So they are honest in saying, yeah, a Roman girl wouldn't have thought there's anything wrong with slavery. Lindsay Davis, interestingly, was quite modern in her approach to her family in ancient Rome. There's a lot of things that sound more like something happening today. You know, the wife who is very determined and is never... Basically, she is portrayed throughout the books as being very much her own person. She never just lets her husband tell her what to do, as at least according to what the sources we have would tell us Roman women would have done. But in their treatment of slaves, it's very Roman. The main character only ever complains about the deficiencies of certain slaves he has. He never once seems to question the fairness of having slaves at all. So I really think if you want to play Romans in a good light, you just have to accept that that's an iffy area. If on the other hand you want to portray Romans as the baddies, slavery is going to make your life very easy.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for being on the programme with us today. Well, thank you again to Thomas Peaple for joining us today, and thank you all for watching. And while this was a heavy subject, I hope it was well informing and a good source of learning for you, and it was lovely having you here.